I hope you can hear me. Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes, we can hear
good,
you.
Yes.
great. We did a little rehearsal before everybody joined, but then my internet connection dropped. So I'm just checking that everything's working again now. So I will try to share my presentation slides. Okay. Can you see something that looks like the beginning of a presentation?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
can you
we can see.
Yes, okay.
Great.
Okay. So I'm always a little bit unsure with these online things if anybody is still there and if you can see what you're supposed to see. So just asking for some feedback.
Looks good. And it's all full screen, so you're set with that.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so the title of the presentation that I'd like to give to you today is Bears, Wolves, Lynx, and Jackals Living with Large Carnivores in Slovakia. Now, maybe I should say that for North America, possibly some of these are not considered large, lynx and jackals, for example. But in European terms, so including in Slovakia, these are considered large carnivores. That's why I've included them. This picture here, also for you, again, for North American people, this might not be that surprising to see a bear. And this was a mother bear with a couple of cubs foraging at the roadside. But as I'll mention later in the presentation as we go through, this is sort of less normal for some people in Slovakia. Let's say like that for now. But this was a picture from a couple of weeks ago in Slovakia. Okay, so just very briefly, because I have given a presentation for your group before, but for those who didn't see it, I'll just mention, yes, as was said in the introduction, that I'm actually British by birth, but I have now lived more than half my life in Slovakia. And I came here, first of all, in 1996 as a conservation volunteer on a working holiday. So I just came for a couple of weeks to begin with, but I loved it so much. That's a picture of me doing a terrible job of scything a hay meadow in the summer. But yeah, I just loved it so much that I offered to come back for a year as a volunteer, and then that year became another year and another year, and it's just gone on and on. And from the very beginning, my main interest was in wolves, which I just find really fascinating animals. And almost everybody has an opinion or at least a feeling about wolves, and that was part of the interest for me. And that goes for countries even where there aren't any anymore. You know, say the word wolf in Britain, everybody will think of something, even though there aren't any there. And this was kind of reflected in this book, a very famous book from 1978, I think it was published, called Of Wolves and Men, which I would highly recommend. And I've put this here because of that very striking image of this direct stare of a wolf, very intense. And I was lucky enough to experience this myself. Unfortunately, I didn't get a picture like this, which is why I've used this one. But I wasn't quite as close as that, but pretty close. I was close enough to see those penetrating yellow eyes staring at me, and that was a really exciting moment for me. This was my first photo of a wolf in Slovakia, so from quite a lot further away, and you certainly can't see its eyes looking back at you. And I haven't got many photos of wolves in the wild, I'll be honest, but luckily these days for research, we have a lot of other tools which can tell us a huge amount about animals without ever even needing to see them. So this image here was taken from a trail camera. Okay, and so as I say, I loved the place so much basically that I stayed initially in eastern Slovakia, but then after 4 or 5 years, I moved to Liptov, which is where I live now. And if you can see the houses amongst the trees in the middle of the picture there, that's the little village that I live in at the moment, surrounded by large carnivore habitat. So we have bears regularly passing by and wolves not far away. So just to explain to you the content of my actual talk today. So I'm going to start out by giving you a little bit of background information on the situation of large carnivores in Europe by way of context. And then I'm going to go through a sort of whistle-stop tour of the 4 species that we have in Slovakia. So bear, and that's brown bear, by the way, European brown bear, grey wolves. So those 2 species you also have in North America, of course, and then Eurasian lynx and golden jackal. And then we'll talk a little bit about what work we've done or are doing at the Slovak Wildlife Society in relation to those species. And I'm going to conclude by mentioning how you could help if you would like to. Okay, so for some context, I was giving a talk in Košice, which is Slovakia's 2nd largest city in the east, as you probably know, back in 2020. And the hosts of that talk put together a little text, to advertise it in their program. And amongst other things, they wrote that we know that through shooting and deforestation, these predatory beasts are disappearing before our eyes. So it's quite negative take on the situation. I thought to myself at the time, are we sure that's true? And I'll kind of answer the question as we go through the talk. Now, in the world we live in today, there is the nature and the environment are definitely under siege, let's say. Plastic pollution is an enormous problem we see there. Climate, temperature, resulting in some really dramatic events that are becoming increasingly frequent. In this case, fires in Australia. In my opinion, there is without doubt a crisis in terms of climate and also biodiversity and pollution, which is often called a triple planetary crisis. But large carnivores in Europe kind of go against that trend. They've actually been doing quite well over the last few decades, and it's something of a success story. On the left, I just included the abstract, the summary of a scientific paper that was published several years ago already. This was 2014, on the recovery of large carnivores in Europe's modern human-dominated landscapes. So they've actually come back from being much worse off in the mid to late, mid, let's say, 20th century. And this map here shows the latest report on numbers and range of, in this case, wolves, but the report covers the other species as well, in Europe. And this assessment was prepared by the Large Carnivore Initiative for Europe for the European Commission. And what it's showing in summary is since the previous such report was prepared, which was in 2016, there's been a 35% increase in the size of the area of Europe which has wolf presence, and about a 35% increase in the numbers of wolves. So they're kind of bucking the trend of this loss of biodiversity. They're actually coming back and increasing, spreading westwards. I mentioned wolves in particular. I say that report covered the other species as well, but I picked out wolves part because I like them, and also because I've just come back from a conference called Wolves Across Borders that was held in the Netherlands this week. I literally came back a couple of hours ago on the night train, and that title of the conference was very appropriate. Wolves Across Borders in Europe. There are many different countries in very close proximity. It's the whole continent is a real mosaic of countries, and wolves are spreading out and crossing those borders. So what about Slovakia then? We have a look at what's happened here. In terms of wolves, it kind of reflects that overall picture, really. So in the past, they were driven down to a very low point through intensive hunting, essentially. So they were persecuted in the past here, as in other places in Europe, and indeed as in North America. They were seen as a harmful, um, troublesome pest, essentially, vermin. So they were killed by any means that people could think of, including poisoning, trapping, whatever. And in Slovakia, they were really pushed back to the northeast corner. So this map is the eastern half of the country, and those black dots represent wolves that were shot in 1973. You can see there's a few little clusters, so those really represent the last few packs that were remaining at that time. So they were in danger of being eradicated from Slovakia in the 70s, 1970s. But then there was a watershed moment. So this man here, Dr. Voskar, at that time was a government employed biologist, and he was working on endangered species, as we would now call them. And he realized the plight of the wolf, that there were fewer and fewer, and if things continued in that way, they were in danger of being eradicated from Slovakia. So he initiated, first of all, a research campaign, a fact-finding mission, if you like, and then advocated for giving wolves legal protection, which they hadn't had up to then. And his work essentially led to the first legislation in Slovakia that protected wolves. So trapping, poisoning, and removing pups from dens were banned, and there was a closed season on hunting introduced from spring to autumn. And that law came into effect in 1975. So coincidentally, this is the 50th anniversary of that first legal protection of wolves, which allowed the population to recover. So in this chart along the bottom, you've got the years beginning 1975, so when that law was introduced, and then on the other axis, you have estimated numbers of wolves. Now I've drawn a line through the actual numbers there. You see on the top left, you've got 3,000 wolves. There are not 3,000 wolves in Slovakia, but those are according to official numbers. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But those are not the correct numbers, but they do show the trend of the population. So essentially that legal protection allowed wolves to recover, and the population is probably still growing now, it seems, though still with some shooting going on. Now that question that I've alluded to there of how many are there is still the subject of debate. Typically, hunters and livestock farmers think there are more, perhaps even too many, whereas environmentalist conservationists think there are fewer, not enough. That's the kind of classic dichotomy, classic dispute, if you like. So I've included this video here from a trail camera that we had out for some time, which if the video works, I'm going to ask you if you can try to count how many wolves you think you can see crossing this little stream. So let's see if it will play. Okay, that's the end of it. Did you see any moving animals there? Somebody let me know if it worked.
4 or 5?
4 or 5. Anybody else? Would you like to see it again? Just for
Yeah, that'd be
fun?
great.
Yeah, okay. Let's see if I can play it again.
I saw 5.
Okay, so you ready? I think there's one already in the shot when it starts. Bear that in mind. So here we go.
I saw 5. Counting the one that was already there would be 6.
Yeah, I reckon I can see 6. But yeah, there are always some different numbers come out when I show that to people. Anyway, yeah, but so it's tricky. No, counting wolves is a tricky thing. I'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. Let's say a few words about their diet. So in Slovakia, we found through analyzing scats, which is kind of the usual way of doing these things, so collecting feces and analyzing them in the lab, we found that more than 90% of what they're eating is wild prey, and most of that are the deer species that we have here. So in the area where I am now, Liptov, that's red deer, which is like very similar to your elk, and roe deer, which is a much smaller deer species, and also wild boar. And then a small percentage, a couple of percentage points are other carnivores, so things like foxes, badgers, perhaps martins. That would be the blue on the chart there. And then the red, sorry, that's not translated, but, or maybe it's Slovak. So those are livestock, essentially. Now the chart that I've shown you there, that's based on summer diet, actually. So if we included the winter or looked at the diet throughout the whole year, that proportion of livestock would be even less, because during winter here, the majority of livestock is enclosed in barns, which are typically quite secure and not really accessible to wolves. And then just to mention the hunting quotas. So I kind of said that although the situation now is very different, so 50 years ago, or until 50 years ago, let's say, the intention, the aim of hunters at that time and livestock farmers and others was to get rid of wolves. So the goal was really to exterminate them. That's no longer the case. So now, if you talk to people, they would usually say, wolves belong here. They're part of the ecosystem. We accept that. But there are still discussions about how many there are, how many people think there should be. And that ties into allowing hunting quotas. So again, I've just mentioned, just included this, that we can talk in more detail about it later if you're interested. But so this chart starts from 2009. As you can see, the red line are hunting quotas. So for those first few years on the chart, it's around between 120 and 150 were the quotas. They were filled, and in a couple of years even actually exceeded. So more wolves were shot than were supposed to have been, say. But then there was an intervention by the European Union, something called an infringement proceeding, which, if you're not familiar with that, it's essentially asking questions about what's going on to determine if management is compatible with European law. So that infringement was open because of the complaints due to those very high quotas. And as you can see, in response, so Slovakia reduced the quotas quite considerably, but also introduced stricter rules for hunters, which made it harder for them to kill wolves. So those smaller quotas were not filled. And yeah, and then there've been a couple of changes since then. So we had a government from 2020 till 2023, which put the wolf on the strictly protected species list in Slovakia. So hunting it, there was no quotas were set for hunting for 3 years, 2021, 2023. But now the current government is more pro-hunting, so they have resumed setting quotas for wolf hunting. And then another very important step which came out of that EU involvement was the preparation of a management plan. So prior to that, Slovakia had not had a management plan for wolves, or indeed any of the other large carnivores. But at that time, through a process of all interested groups and stakeholders, so farmers, hunters, as well as conservationists, foresters, and others, got together in a structured process and thrashed out their differences and managed to reach some sort of compromise to be able to sign off a management plan. So that's the one for wolves there. And there was also one for bears and lynx too. So that was quite a positive step, I would say. Okay, and then next, so I'm doing these in a slightly different order from what I mentioned in the title of the talk, but I'm going on to golden jackal next. I'm only going to say a couple of things about this, but maybe this is a less familiar species to some of you, but it's been compared to coyotes in North America, and in terms of its size and behavior and role within an ecosystem. So I said at the beginning, some people would question whether this is really a large carnivore. No, others might call it a mesocarnivore, a sort of mid-size carnivore. But in Europe, well, certainly the Large Carnivore Initiative for Europe has included it as one of the species it deals with, let's say. And another similarity with North America, in a sense, is that in recent years, the range of the golden jackal in Europe has expanded very considerably. So it used to be found really only in the southeastern part, so Balkans, Greece, Bulgaria, Croatia, places like that. But during the last couple of decades, it's been popping up all over, even up in Scandinavia. And there's been a lot of discussion and debate about why that is. Now, it seems to me that surely that's going to be related to climate change. As temperatures rise, species that was previously further south will find those sorts of temperatures as it's used to further north. But analyses have been done by other researchers who've concluded that the data fits more with the reduction in range of the wolf in the past due to hunting, essentially freeing up more habitat for jackals, and those jackals have spread out as a result of their, in the past, not having been wolves. I say that a comparison has been made with a similar process in North America, where wolves were extirpated from some areas, allowing coyotes to move in. Here I've just that's an article from a hunting magazine discussing this jackal expansion. The first individuals identified in Slovakia were in the 1990s. They were shot, mistaken for other species, essentially, or hunters didn't know what they were. But then, so after having been shot, then they were identified as being male jackals. So in the first several in the 90s were males, dispersing males, exploring new areas, new territories, and then eventually females also appeared and set up pairs and began reproducing within Slovakia. This is the expansion that I mentioned to you, again from the same report, the Large Carnivore Initiative report for the European Union that I showed you earlier on for the wolf. So this is the same map for the jackal. You see their real stronghold is in Southeast Europe, but the little dots are really scattered far and wide. And here, Slovakia is kind of up the front of the range, but where breeding is established. And I haven't translated this on the slide, but the top left, so this is showing jackal occurrences from 2009 to 2016. And then on the top right, you've got some numbers. Again, I didn't have time to add the most recent years, but the clear trend there, the increase in numbers has been ongoing since then. Okay, so then another species, and again, I've put this one in next because sometimes this is also discussed in relation to wolves, and there's a kind of old widespread belief, or at least there used to be, I would say, amongst hunters in Slovakia, that where you have wolves, you can't have lynx, that wolves somehow outcompete or push out lynx. So I included this next slide here. These are actually results of our work that I'm going to mention later, but as we've been doing field work, studying the occurrence of wolves and trying to estimate numbers of wolves, we very often come across signs of lynx in the same area. So the numbers and the chart on this page are based on snow tracking. Essentially, where we find signs of wolf presence, tracks in the snow, we very often find lynx as well, and sometimes in exactly the same places. So I don't see evidence for that belief. On the right there, you see some, the black dots are an indication of the prevalence of wolves, so how often we come across them while we're doing surveys by snow tracking, and then the blue dots are same areas for lynx. And during the first few years, it seemed like as the frequency that we found signs of wolves decreased, so, at the same time, the frequency that we were coming across signs of lynx seemed to be increasing. So for a while, and then the reverse also occurred. So when stricter wolf protection came in from 2013, after that intervention by the EU, the infringement process that I was telling you about, so you can see the wolves started to recover and increase in numbers, and then the lynx occurrences seemed to go down. So during that first 5-6 years, I was wondering if, maybe wolves don't exclude lynx, but perhaps they do have some influence on the numbers. But then after that, both increased strongly at the same time. So that didn't seem to hold true. So it might be that the numbers of wolves and the numbers of lynx are varying independently of each other, according to different things, maybe prey availability or some other factor. And it's not that wolf numbers are influencing lynx numbers, perhaps. Another thing that I was going to mention is lynx for a researcher, they have a very handy attribute, which is they have unique coat patterns. So we can use these to identify individuals if we either see them directly, or in this case, very often by using trail cameras. If you have a good quality image where you can see the coat pattern clearly enough, then you can compare between pictures and pick out whether these two pictures are of the same individual or not. And in this case, they are. And then by having a large number of cameras deployed in the field systematically, and getting a sufficient number of pictures, then potentially you can estimate the number of individuals present in the area, either as just a minimum count, what's the number of different individuals that you get pictures of, or if you have sufficient data, then you can use some other techniques, things called capture, mark recapture, spatial recapture, modeling to estimate the total number of individuals in the area. So this is an example from 2 study areas where we were involved in this estimation. So there's the Stiavnice Mountains and the Velká Fatra National Park in successive winters. So there we estimated the number of individuals to be less than 1 lynx per 100 square kilometers, so showing that they live at very low densities, and actually even lower than people had realized here. So lynx, until relatively recently, they'd not received very much attention from researchers in Slovakia, and wasn't really that much known about them. But that's changed quite a bit in recent years. They mostly feed on roe deer, by the way. That's their main prey here. So that's the smaller of the 2 native deer species that we have. So whereas wolves tend to prey more often on red deer, lynx would go, the larger of the 2 species, the more elk-sized one, lynx tend to go for roe deer, maybe occasionally a female red deer or young red deer, but certainly not an adult male red deer. It's too big for them. And then other things that they'd prey on would be things like brown hares and smaller prey items, rodents, birds. Okay, and then a very positive story, I would say, from Slovakia is that it has been a source of lynx, of live lynx, to either bolster or re-establish populations of lynx elsewhere in Europe where they were extirpated, where they'd been wiped out or driven down to very low numbers. And this began quite a long time ago, before people knew anything much about wildlife genetics and so on. So the early reintroduction efforts began in the 60s. So lynx were live trapped, typically in box traps like you see in the illustration there, and then went through quarantine in zoo facilities and then were transported to various other countries around Europe and then released into the wild. In some cases, several animals were released. In a couple of cases, not very many. I'm not really sure how it was thought that releasing one individual was going to help, but like in the case of Italy, for example, and Germany only had a couple. But Switzerland and Czechia and some other places did manage to establish populations, or their own populations of lynx based on these animals that they received from Slovakia. And then on this slide, I've only included up to 1987, but it didn't end there actually, and there've been much more recent projects too. So Slovenia is mentioned on the slide there, but their population had got into trouble because not many animals founded their population, and probably several of those that were released there originally were related to each other. So there was a very small number of founding individuals, and after some time it started suffering from inbreeding depression, so decreased rates of reproduction. And so they really needed additional animals to help reinvigorate the population, introduce some new genes. So there was a new project which just finished relatively recently called Life Lynx, which again took animals from Slovakia as well as Romania this time to release into Slovenia and Croatia, and that's helped to improve the genetic status of their population. And there have been other reintroductions elsewhere in Germany, for example. So a nice positive story from Slovakia, I would say there. Which brings us on to the bear, which is more tricky in some ways. So just want to remind you, so these are brown bears, same species as grizzlies, a different subspecies. So European brown bears, males can get up to, big old males can get up to 350 kilos. So what, over 700 pounds. So these are pretty big animals. Again, it's the same method that I mentioned for wolves. We've studied these in the Tatras by scat analysis and found, sorry, the slides are moving by themselves. We found that their diet in this area, Tatras, is around 85-90% plant-based. And bears need a large amount of food. They can eat 10 or 15 kilos per day. And especially in the summer and autumn, they need to build up sufficient fat reserves to last them through the winter. So a lot of their lives revolves around food and feeding. I'll come back to that in a minute. In terms of their range, so where they occur in Slovakia, this is a map from, sorry, it keeps changing. This is a map from a few years ago, but it still more or less holds true. So the most frequent occurrence of bears, or their highest densities, are in central Slovakia. So places like the Tatras, Malá Veľká Fatra, Polana, Slovenské Rudohorie, so those mountain ranges in central Slovakia. And then there's a bit of a break as you go east with not so many bears around Prešov and slightly eastwards until you get to Poloniny and the Eastern Carpathians on the border with Ukraine and Poland, where again there's slightly more. So a little bit of a gap, which was known about. But what was a surprise coming out of some genetic studies was that there seemed to be maybe not 100% gap, but limited migration between bears north of that horizontal line and south of it. Now going through there is a transport corridor. You have the main highway, the D1, plus the rail line, and then a lot of urbanized areas, which in some parts creates effectively a linear barrier that's quite difficult for animals to cross back and forth. And that showed up in the genetics. So bears north of that line are a little bit different from those to the south. Okay, now I mentioned that bears are a little bit tricky, so I'm going to go into some more details on that. And first of all, a quick look back at history. So how have we got to where we are? Can describe bear recovery in Slovakia in several phases, I would say. So the low point was in the 30s, so earlier than with wolves, but essentially for the same reason. They were persecuted as being an animal that killed people's livestock or damaged beehives and caused some other problems, and also overhunting for trophies and so on. So they were driven down to very low numbers in the 30s. Estimates of that time, contemporary estimates, spoke about a few tens of bears, essentially, probably less than 100. So that's that period there where numbers were being driven down and reached a low point in the 30s. So low numbers, high hunting pressure, decline. But it was recognized then by hunting community that if things continued in that way, there'd be no bears left. No bear hunters wouldn't have anything to hunt. So in 1932, there was a ban on hunting. Which allowed the remaining bears to slowly recover. So without any introductions of additional animals, just reproduction of those remaining animals slowly resulted in a population stabilization and then slow growth. By the time things got to the to the 1960s, let's say, it was perceived that the numbers were now growing more quickly. And hunting was reintroduced in order to, or in an effort to slow or control that ongoing population growth. But nevertheless, numbers continued to rise despite hunting being re-begun. So those bars there are showing the numbers of bears that were shot each year. As you can see, that it reached its highest level in the early 90s, and then the numbers of bears being shot declined, essentially because more restrictions on how hunting could be done or which bears could be hunted were introduced. So that lowered the hunting success. So numbers of bears continue to rise. And indeed, when we get to this most recent phase here, as I've identified it, so now we have, relatively speaking, high bear numbers, higher than before, or higher than in the last 150 years, certainly. Low hunting pressure and rapid growth in numbers. And that's resulted in a number of things. So, I mean, on the positive side, so bears have been recovered in Slovakia. You know, they have returned to areas where they'd been absent. You know, they're now within the ecosystem. They were saved from the brink of extinction in Slovakia, so that's on the positive side. On the other side, their return has, in combination with some human activities, let's say, or things that people do, does result in some difficulties. So one of them is bears getting into garbage bins, you know, or generally searching for food near people and making a nuisance of themselves, essentially. And then a second thing that's a very hot topic in recent years are direct encounters between people and bears, which happen for a number of different reasons or in different circumstances, let's say. But that's really been making the news in the last couple of years, and indeed has become highly politicized, actually. So this was an election billboard, you know, election campaign poster from one of the parties that's now in the government. So this was their pre-election campaign, and Medved, you might recognize, is the word for bear, and the slogan underneath it. So the bear is not more than a person. So they were really sort of highlighting the view of some people within Slovakia that bears were overprotected and more protected than people, it was felt. So that's a kind of overview of those species, and I'm going to say a little bit about what we have done in respect to them. So Slovak Wildlife Society is a non-profit that we set up in the late 90s, and it's working towards a science-based approach to management. We promote and encourage the use of non-lethal prevention measures to solve some of these issues that I've mentioned. So in the photo there, you have a livestock guarding dog. So this is the traditional Slovak version of a livestock guarding dog, a čuvač. We also encourage and work towards collaboration between interest groups. You know, so we're not a protest group. We try to work with people rather than against them. We also encourage public engagement in conservation and have done quite a lot of work on environmental education. So that's our sort of overall philosophy or approach, if you like. And then specifically on large carnivores, actually most of our work is about large carnivores. So when we began, the things that we saw more or less straight away as sort of opportunities or things that we thought would be good to encourage in Slovakia were ecotourism. So not just to look on the negative aspects of large carnivores, no, but what's good about having them around. How can people benefit from having large carnivores around? Well, one of them is to make money, essentially, you know, from ecotourism. So we started a little program, almost like a sort of demonstration thing, so that we could suggest to people, well, maybe you could do this. You could offer a guiding service or provide some accommodation or some other programs and activities based around large carnivores. And it also has an educational aspect too. So this is a much younger me sort of discussing with participants in a group there, discussing that red deer that we just found that had been killed and eaten by wolves. And then over the years, actually, as I think at least partly as bears have become more numerous, now they've become easier to see. So that provides then an opportunity for bear watching tours. So that's an example in the Tatras there. And again, we have a program for that, so bear watching tours, which is an end in and of itself for us. It's a little extra income stream for our organization, and as a non-profit, it's useful to have that. But a sort of bigger point was, as I say, to promote the idea that other people could do this to benefit from. And I would say I've seen not a huge, but a small growth in the numbers of people offering bear-themed experiences, bear watching tours. Another big part of what we do is helping people. So really trying to find solutions which benefit both people and wildlife. So in this case, we're helping this sheep farmer here in Liptov to install some electric fencing to protect his sheep from wolves and bears. The idea being, if the farmers lose fewer livestock, then there's less reason for them to call for predators to be controlled through hunting. This is again the Chuvach that I mentioned. So we had a project on helping farmers to protect their livestock with livestock guarding dogs. More examples here. So the main part of the project ran from 2000 to 2004, and we provided farmers with pups. Generally, you need to start with young pups of about 6 to 8 weeks of age, raise them together with the stock that you want them to protect. And we found that at farms where they followed that methodology, their losses were, so they lost 70% fewer of their sheep to bears and wolves than other farms in the same regions that didn't have those dogs. So it made quite a big difference. Regarding bears, yeah, we've had projects, again, like a demonstration level, showing how garbage could be secured either in specially designed bins like in the top left there, or by putting existing bins in a cage that would keep bears out. And in the bottom left there, that's testing a refuse container in a zoo here, inspired by the program in West Yellowstone, which does things like that, testing of bear resistant containers of various types. And here working with a beekeeper to help him to install electric fencing to keep bears out of his beehives, which again we found is highly effective if it's done correctly, following certain parameters with the installation and then keeping it well maintained. The issue of encounters is as I've said, a really tricky one, a very emotive one at the moment. We've had an increasing number of incidents in which people have been injured by bears. And in 2021, we had the first person killed by a bear in Slovakia for 100 years. And since then, 3 more people have apparently died in encounters. That's quite a major change. Small numbers, but more than before. And obviously serious incidents when people are dying. So that's received a huge amount of attention. And we've done various things on that, trying to identify the circumstances in which this occurs. So what apparently are the triggers for bears attacking people, and therefore how could people best avoid that happening to them. And then also for several years now, we've been importing bear spray from Montana, which was totally unheard of here in Slovakia. Certainly 20 years ago, anyone who hadn't themselves been to a North American national park had no idea that bear spray even existed. So we began importing it again as a sort of on a demonstration level to show people that this thing exists, and if you're concerned, you could carry this, and yes, it does work. And now it's quite regularly mentioned. I'd say still the majority of people hiking in national parks in Slovakia don't carry it, but it's more known as a thing that does exist, and some people do carry it. We've done a lot of education work of various kinds, some materials for teachers on the top left there, some practical activities in the middle. Some of our volunteers there painting bear prints on a bear-proof bin to help show people what the purpose of the bin is. A trip out to the mountains there with some school kids, and then the one on the top right there with everybody staring intently at a patch of mud. That was a field course by an organization by experts from an organization called Cyber Tracker, which is a a way of, sort of systematically using tracking skills to inform wildlife monitoring and also personal development, learn how to do tracking. So we hosted them and ran a workshop and then an assessment with them leading it. This now looks ancient, this website. It's in desperate need of updating, but we set up sort of the first specialized website on bears in Slovakia, trying to provide as much information as we could to the public on bears themselves. So going back 20 years, the majority of people that I was meeting in Slovakia knew almost nothing about bears. Even those people who lived in areas with bears, they didn't know what they ate, they didn't know how they behaved, they didn't know very much about safety. There was real lack of awareness, I would say. So we'd spent a lot of time and effort trying to increase people's understanding and awareness of bears, and including through this website. And then another important topic which we've had some involvement with is participatory processes. So various ways of getting diverse groups of people together, so rather than hunters and environmentalists, let's say, arguing with each other in perpetuity, can they somehow have a constructive dialogue and come to some kind of agreement, some compromise? So there've been various things of those. I mentioned the wolf management plan earlier, which was written in that way, and then the document that I've shown there, this was a study that we implemented in collaboration with several partners from the hunting side, as well as nature conservation, to improve the scientific study of wolves, to have a better idea of how many there are. That's the management plan I already mentioned. And this is a meeting to discuss wolf hunting. And then, as I've said, so we also conduct monitoring of wolves in an independent way. So we're neither, we try to be as objective as possible is what I mean by that. So to really use science to look at what's going on and try not to be influenced by either one side or the other side in the debate. So we conduct this every winter in the Liptov region, which is about 2,000 square kilometers, 770 square miles, around 10% of the wolf range in Slovakia. It's a citizen science project, also led by experienced experts, both experienced in the field and also geneticists. But then every year we have volunteer field crews that we train, who then help us to collect the data and samples. It's funded by donations and crowdfunding, essentially, and contributions from the volunteers themselves. And then the methods are all non-invasive. Non-invasive meaning we don't have to handle any animals. We don't have to capture the animals to put collars on them or anything like that. So it's starts out with snow tracking, and then as we doing that, we collect any samples of biological material from which we can extract DNA and therefore identify which individual wolves the sample came from. And then using capture mark recapture, which is the method that I mentioned earlier for estimating lynx numbers, we can also do that with wolves. But in this case, instead of having lots of photos of wolves, we're identifying the individual wolves on the basis of their DNA fingerprint. Yeah, which brings us to the end of the presentation, essentially. So I wanted to end it by mentioning how you could help. So one of the ways is you can come and help us track in the next winter season. So again, at the moment we're recruiting volunteers for the next winter. Those are the dates. It's always mid-January to early February. Now, to keep a consistency from one year to the next, we always do it at the same time of year. And there are several reasons why we chose this time. So traditionally, this is just after the end of the wolf hunting season, so we can assess what's the status of the population after the hunting season. it's also been consistently the best time of year for having snow cover, to facilitate snow tracking and therefore sample collection. Also then, because it's cold, the samples are better preserved. The DNA doesn't degrade so fast at colder temperatures. And it goes into the wolf breeding season, so we can see some of their mating activity as well. So we'll be doing that this winter, so you'd be very welcome to join, or if you can't join yourselves, maybe you could help to spread the word. And then, of course, there are other ways that you could help too, including we have a GoFundMe page there. You'd be very welcome to help support our efforts through a donation if you feel that you'd like to do that. And that is the end of the presentation that I prepared for you, but I can try to answer some questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Robin. Absolutely. At this time, I'd love to turn it over for questions. I see we do have a raised hand from Christina. Please go right ahead with your question. If you'd like, you can also share some questions in the chat as well.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a really nice presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have several questions. I was just wondering, we've had chuvachs, and so we're especially interested in the chuvach question. We were wondering, after the chuvach study that you said ended in 2004, I think, have there been further efforts to spread the use of chuvachs, since they obviously seem to be so, effective? And have you been in contact with Jana Goliashova at all, who's up there in Pribilina by you, which is our friend who raises chuvachs? She's the breed consultant. And also, I was wondering, is there a level at which you'd consider there to be an overpopulation of bears? And does there need to be hunting now, do you think, to control the population? Or would you still prefer to have a total ban on the hunting? Of course, I'm against hunting, but I'm just wondering, like, technically, do they get out of control? I mean, I guess they might get out of control. So what's your view on that? And the third thing, I think that because of the carbon footprint problem about, air travel, really people, if they go to help you, they should stay at least half a year. So that would be really good, I think. So anyway, or a year, or maybe, I don't know, several years. I don't know. So those are my two questions and third comment. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I can remember all the questions. So the first one were the dog-related one. So yes, so during the project and then in the year or two subsequently, we did see a number of farms adopt the method themselves. So the situation when we started actually was chuvach and other livestock guarding dogs were at most farms, I would say, or most farms that I visited, but they weren't being used fully. So the typical approach was to just have them chained up somewhere near where the sheep were sleeping at night. So they could bark, but they couldn't chase predators away. They couldn't patrol to mark the area. They were just like a living alarm, essentially, to wake up the shepherds if anything happened, which wasn't very effective, but had become the habit. So we were trying to get people to go back to the traditional way of doing it, as I described. So yes, we did see some farmers who saw the project dogs or spoke to the farmers who were involved and then wanted to do that themselves. So there was some spread, it went much slower than I was hoping, but there was some spread. And then since then, there have been several more efforts by other people to continue that work. And it took a long time, but eventually the government started putting more emphasis on those approaches. They've still not offered very much financial support. It's sort of more or less up to farmers to do it themselves and to pay for it themselves, which I think is a shame. But they are at least encouraged to use them. So hopefully that. And then, do I know Jana Goliashova? Yes.
Yeah, I think that
I used to live.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I used to live in Pribilina, so we've met.
Oh, yeah, I think that the
We've met.
chuvach breeders are of two minds, though, because I think they would like them to be used for the traditional purposes, but when they do actually go to work as LGDs, there have been instances of, hunters shooting the dogs, and so like they're kind of, torn,
Yeah.
like what to do really.
Yes. Yeah, but then they were working dogs originally. But yes, I've certainly come across that concern, and the other one that maybe nowadays it's a little bit better, but during the time of our project, the dogs that we provided weren't always as well looked after, as we would have liked. So that was a concern mentioned by dog breeders as well. Yeah.
And if you could just also answer about whether you think there should be a hunting ban on bears.
Yeah. Well, so the current government has already restarted bear hunting essentially. So last year, close to 100 bears were killed, and this year they announced a few weeks ago that they intend to allow 350 to be hunted. Now I'm kind of split, I must say. I mean, for me, the idea that 350 bears would be killed in a single year is concerning. I'm not quite sure what they're basing that on. So I certainly have concerns about it. On the other hand, I do understand that a lot of people are worried. After having no fatalities in a century and then 4 in 4 years, and many other attacks as well, I can fully understand that people are concerned. Yeah, so I'm a bit torn on that, I must say, if that
Understandable.
answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly like to see much more emphasis, put, much more information sharing. As I say, we did a lot of that around the time that we set up that website that I showed you. So back in sort of 2005 to about 2012, we a lot of we're only a small organization, so we can't do everything all the time. So we spent several years really focused on bears. And I think there has been a general increase in people's awareness and knowledge still since then, but it's still not really a given that people here know how to avoid sudden encounters with bears or how they should behave during an encounter. I say there's more information available than before, but I think there's still more room for that. Promoting non-lethal methods, understanding bear behavior. I'd like to see more emphasis on that.
Thank you.
And and then you had a third thing, I think, wasn't there, or was that already covered?
No, I was just saying people should stay with you a lot longer.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, I do. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm trying to reduce my own travel footprint as well. Say when I went to this wolf conference in the Netherlands this week, I took the night train from Vienna towards Amsterdam and back again, rather than flying. So yeah, I do agree with that.
Lucky you in Europe with trains.
Yeah, and they're very nice actually. The night trains these days are really, really nice.
Thank you so much for all of those questions and responses. I am just checking the chat here. I am seeing a question from Ronald. Decades ago, Romania imported some brown bears from Alaska to broaden their genetic pool. Are there any reports on the degree of success or the effect of the addition? Or, any similar programs in Slovakia?
So brown bears were taken from Alaska to Romania. I was not aware of that. And certainly in
Well, that happened back during the communist times still, so it must have been before 1990. And whether it was taken in for apparatchiks to have a big bear hunt or to actually increase the gene pool. I don't really know, but they were supposedly concerned about the small diminishing size of the bears in Romania at the time.
Right. Yes, and I know that Ceausescu was big on bear hunting, and sort of quite a lot of bears were raised and released in Romania in order to then be available for hunting, essentially. In Slovakia, I have read that a couple, like a small number of bears were brought to Slovakia from Romania when the population was much lower. I'm not sure if they successfully integrated, because releasing animals into a population is one thing, but then do they become part of that population? Do they actually reproduce? That's another thing. And then back during those times, there was no wildlife genetics as we now know it, so that it was harder to follow what fate those animals had and if they contributed to future generations or not. So I think in Slovakia, that's certainly not been a major thing. It's more been a natural population recovery following, well, those 30 years of a hunting ban, and then relatively low levels of hunting, allowed the population to increase by itself. Plus also plenty of habitat and food sources, and see a lot of bears going to feed in cornfields. And I wonder, and not just bears, wild boar and deer do that as well. So I wonder if the widespread availability of corn has also contributed to population growth.
Next question here that I see in the chat, I see from Donald. You mentioned a close personal encounter with a wolf. What is your best guidance for returning a wolf's glare or, really interacting with these animals in the wild?
Yeah, and so in Slovakia, we very rarely see them. They're really wary, and our habitats here are forest dominated. I mean, they do come out onto open areas, meadows, and so on, but mainly dawn and dusk and at night. So here they're pretty hard to see. So when you do get to see them, it's enjoy basically. In the wider context of what should you do if you encounter a wolf at a short distance? I mean, it's extremely rare that they would present any kind of danger or threat, if that's what you mean. Rarely within Europe, and this was a topic of the conference that I mentioned, by the way. So rarely within Europe there have been some cases of so-called bold wolves, which are not so afraid of people and don't necessarily run away immediately, and might even approach or allow people to approach them. But it seems that it's a very small number of individuals. So it's, statistically, you're unlikely to meet one of them. But if you did, then you should either stand your ground or move away. Certainly don't approach a wolf, but don't run away either, because that could trigger an instinctive pursuit. But I say, in the majority of cases, wolves try to avoid people and will run away if they encounter them. So I felt very lucky and privileged in my case. It was about 30 meters from me, about 30 yards, 30 meters maximum, maybe slightly less than that. There were two of them, and they were resting. So this was sort of mid-morning, and I was walking up a trail in the snow, and they'd arrived at that point from the opposite side. So as I came up, they heard me, jumped up. One ran away immediately. I think the female looked smaller, and then the second one, the bigger one, perhaps the male, just stood for several seconds looking at me, and I looked at him, and then he slowly and majestically trotted away. Wow, that was amazing.
Wonderful. I am not seeing any additional questions come through to the chat. One more raised hand from Christina. Go ahead.
Oops, sorry. Just one more question. You haven't really mentioned anything about climate change. And I was just wondering, I mean, other than just like increased numbers of bears, is it possible that, I mean, I know that they eat a lot of the, chuchoriedki, in summertime and stuff. I mean, has there
Yeah.
been some kind of impact of drought and higher temperatures on their food sources that's forcing them to like have more encounters with humans in villages and stuff?
I'm not aware of that having been studied in Slovakia. I mean, it could work. No, the climate is clearly changing or has already changed quite a bit. Winters are much less uniform than they used to be. So when I came in the 90s, what everybody thought of as winter was snow arriving in November, some variation on altitude, of course, but let's say roughly November, and then there'd be snow on the ground through to February at low elevations, and then much later than that in higher elevations. And it was like that every year. Now, sometimes there's no snow until January. This last winter, there wasn't very much snow at all. The winter before that, there was quite a lot, but only for a short period of time, and then it suddenly disappeared within a couple of days. Every winter seems to be different now. And then, yeah, plus periods of very dry weather. It's also clearly getting drier overall. That's just visible and measurable. So there are undoubtedly changes, and that will surely have some impacts on vegetation and therefore food availability. And because bears are eating such a lot of plant material, that's going to impact them. And that could well have consequences for the relationship between bears and people. Shorter winters might therefore bears could be active for more of the year. So then there's more opportunity for encounters to occur, and bears may be active during periods of the year when previously people wouldn't have expected it. And that certainly there have been some years with quite a few incidents, already early in the year. And I've noticed, I've been sort of following the cases of people being attacked and injured since the late 90s, and there are clearly more happening in winter months, or at least what you'd think of as winter months. Plus also around den emergence time, there's a spike in cases happening in March as bears are emerging from their dens. So yeah, I think there's a number of things that could play a role. Yeah, climate and bears.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for all of the wonderful, engaging questions. Are there any more that we have from folks still on the line?
Should I stop sharing the PowerPoint, by the way?
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah.
All right. Hearing none. I see some folks are starting to drop off. Again, thank you everyone for hopping on this Saturday afternoon. I really appreciate it. And Robin, we really, really appreciate your time and your knowledge as well. Thank you so much for joining us again. And thank you all. We'll wrap up for today and look forward to seeing everyone back after our summer hiatus.
I'd also like to thank you for your attention, and if anybody thinks of a question later, I can always try to answer by email if I'm able. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you. Say hi to Slovakia.
Will do.